My name is Betsy Peabody, and I'm Executive Director of Puget Sound Restoration Fund. And we've been working in the kelp space for about a dozen years. And I'm pulling back from the seaweed farming, kelp farming theme for a minute and talking more about bull kelp restoration, so the restoration of kelp forests, the canopy kelp forests in Puget Sound, which is bull kelp. And we're developing practices, but we're going to begin in the bull kelp space and then sort of wend our way into various some seaweed farming, seaweed collection activities. But the first thing that really pulled us into this space was a tribal leader who had observed, he and the Suquamish tribe, this is Leonard Forsman, the chair of the Suquamish tribe, had observed dramatic declines of kelp forests within their usual and accustomed fishing area, which is the area where we are located as an organization. And he said, you should really try to figure this out. And so we were, as an organization, a nonprofit organization, trying to figure out how to restore living species and habitats that are important ecologically, but also important culturally as food sources. So we were working on oysters, we were working on abalone, and then here somebody said, you should really start working on kelp. So that pulled us into this space in 2010. And I just want to note that we have a big kelp team at Puget Sound Restoration Fund. Brian Allen is here. We have 3 other people on the core kelp team, and we also have others in the organization working on kelp, including Emily Buckner here in the front row. So when I say we, I'm talking about the we of the organization, but I'm also talking about the we of all the organizations and partners and funders with whom we work. So, kelp declines is what brought us as an organization into this, and so these 2 maps show you what kelp extent looked like in Puget Sound in 1978. You see all that rich yellow, and then what kelp looked like, kelp presence, extent looked like in 2000, and then just know that since 2000 there have been significant declines. So you can see that this has been a dramatic loss, and it's a dramatic loss that some people are monitoring very closely, including Department of Natural Resources, including academics and researchers, including tribes. But it's also a loss that maybe hasn't been seen and recognized more broadly by many people. So we think of ourselves as being the evergreen state, covered with terrestrial forests, and I think a lot of people are not considering underwater kelp forests as part of that forest extent that has been lost. So I want for us all to push open that definition of forest and get people to start thinking about the above and below forests when we're talking about declines and the need for recovery of these places. So we thought, sort of similar to maybe the way Meg thought when she pulled off the seaweed farming workshop in 2020, we thought, okay, we're going to try to figure this out because somebody just sort of invited us into this space and directed us towards kelp and figure out how to do this thing called restoring kelp forests. And it has been a lot more complicated than we anticipated in the beginning. It's a very complex ecosystem in which we work. It's also a complex regulatory environment in which we work, and there are a lot of things, activities that occur in the marine space, and there are a lot of agencies and people who have strong opinions and authority over what happens in the marine space. So kelp restoration, interestingly, has got to thread the same needle that kelp farming has to thread. or other types of development in the marine system. So that just sort of adds to the complexity of trying to do this thing. But I will say that we're trying to work out a restoration practice. What does that look like? What is an efficient way to try to grow a kelp forest in the marine system at a place where it has disappeared or where significant declines have occurred? And we've kind of settled on an aquaculture practice. So the same way that kelp seed is outplanted at a kelp farm, we're kind of using those same ways to outplant a kelp forest. Only instead of having cultivation lines that might be mid-column, 3 meters below the surface, we've got our cultivation lines that are closer to the benthic surface, so maybe 1.5 feet above that, anchored at both ends. So some of the same infrastructure. So a technique that has successfully been used to grow kelp for all kinds of reasons all over the world. We're taking that technique and saying, okay, can this help to grow a kelp forest back? Can it help bolster seed supply in an area? Can it lead to natural recruitment in that area? So this is kind of what we're testing out over a period of time. So you can see that we've sort of run through a few experiments over the years. You can see the cultivation line on which our bull kelp is growing. We've also tested out using these pyramid-shaped anchors to kind of grow a cluster of kelp within a space. So we're working our way through various experiments, and ultimately what we're doing now is that cultivation line, growing a patch, a dense patch, trying to produce enough reproductive material from that living kelp forest in that space so that it rains down and gives rise to the kelp forest the next year. It's trying to get at that magnitude question. How big does that patch need to be? How dense does it need to be in order to really kickstart that natural recruitment? And we're not there yet, and I hope that someday soon we get there, or that we see kelp recruitment in the spring. As part of this work, we've also needed, in terms of developing our kelp restoration practice, developing our capacity to restore kelp forests that are fundamental as part of the ecosystem and are declining. We've also established a kelp lab at NOAA's Research Center, Manchester Research Center, and this is where we operate a conservation hatchery called the Kenneth K. Chu Center for Shellfish Research and Restoration. It's also where we have a kelp lab, and that's where we've been propagating seed. It's also where we're establishing a seed bank so that we have archived the genetic material from kelp forests around Puget Sound, and we're working with somebody at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Felipe Alberto, and he has assembled that archive of genetic material, and we're going to be importing it, thanks to some import permits from Department of Fish and Wildlife, importing that into Puget Sound, into the Kelp Lab in early 2013, so that potentially we can also develop over time custom blends so that we can figure out what seed will grow best in which areas. So I actually forgot to bring up with me, but as part of our own learning on how to propagate seed, how to make it available for restoration purposes, we've also sort of tried to gather all of our learning in one document, and Emily is going to show. We've just finished this propagation manual, and this is something that we are happy to share with tribal partners and others who are interested in growing kelp for restoration purposes. And this just sort of assembles the lessons that we've learned over the years. And so we have, I think, copies with us. And then we also have Emily, raise your hand, and Brian, raise your hand. Brian's our propagation maestro, and so if there are people who want to connect with them and avail themselves of these resources, they're here. We've also been working with many people here in the audience to produce a kelp conservation and recovery plan that was finalized in 2020. And Department of Natural Resources, Northwest Straits Commission, Tom Mumford here, raise your hand, Tom, who's just one of the most amazing kelp gurus, NOAA, and others, to sort of take a broader look on, first of all, what does kelp do in Puget Sound? How significant is it? There are over 20 species of native kelps in Puget Sound. What do we need to learn about them? What are the priorities? What do we need to know in terms of understanding stressors, monitoring distribution and trends, learning about restoration, increasing awareness and understanding? There are all kinds of things we need to do to help bring kelp to the surface of our consciousness more than it has been writ large. At least in recent times, though of course tribes have been connected to these forests and to all of the resources that come out of the forests for thousands of years. So this gives us a kind of a roadmap. So that particular plan came out in 2020, but what we really wanted to do at Puget Sound Restoration Fund and with all of our partners was just to sort of breathe life into that kelp plan. We don't want it to be just a document. We actually wanted to gather with partners, with tribes, with communities, with scientists at kelp forests throughout Puget Sound, beginning in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and wending our way all the way down to the head of Puget Sound near Olympia at the Squaxin Island Kelp Forest. And again, gather with people along the way to learn. Pew Charitable Trust was one of our partners and helped us venture into this space. Brenda is here. Brenda, raise your hand. We partnered with over 40 different organizations, scientists, agencies, many of whom are here today. And really it was just sort of a deep immersion with other people. This was kind of just coming out of the pandemic and we'd all been holed up. And it was a way to kind of spring ourselves forward, get ourselves out into the system again, looking with multiple eyes, multiple perspectives, different kinds of knowledge banks at these kelp forests so that we could merge our understanding together and really grow this conservation and recovery effort moving forward. So it was really an incredible opportunity. Hannah Garfield with Puget Sound Restoration Fund, she developed a Kelp Story Map, and hopefully you can take a look at that on our website, restorationfund.org, and it really tries to bring in all these multiple layers of understanding and appreciation for the value and the importance of kelp in our ecosystem. We also put together a video working with Florian Grainer called Kelp Lifeways to try to bring to the fore some of the things that we had been learning about kelp during the expedition with our tribal and scientific partners, but also just along the way of our own particular kelp journey. And it's a great video, and it sort of puts it in context of kelp forests, kelp lifeways, providing a route by which early humans, trailblazers, could follow along the coast and people the Americas and continue down to South America. So these places full of an abundance of food. It's a safe passage because kelp forests slow the water down. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who taught us so much during the expedition and who shared the ways in which we should be talking about this. I came into it thinking of this as the Kelp Highway, and Jeff Dickinson, among others, said, you know what, this is not a highway. This is a lifeway. It is living. It is present. This is not a thing of the past. This is an important cultural, ecological resource that today continues to provide and support the base of our food systems here. So we've just sort of got to get ourselves talking about this in the right way. And one of the things that I've learned over the years And it really sort of began through discussions with tribal partners, but it was also, I was nudged in many ways by Tom Mumford over the years, and he has been proselytizing for a good long while about how, about many things, but about how, you know, kelp was not just a habitat structure. And that's how I came into this. I was seeing it as a biogenic living habitat structure. And that for me was all encompassing. That was such an incredibly important thing to try to rebuild. But he really said, it is not just a habitat structure. You know, this is powering our food web. And I think the problem for me, he was really kind of hitting me on the head multiple times over the years, and I was hearing it from him, but as a non-scientist, I don't think that I was incorporating it into my cranium, or it just took me a long while to understand that. So I want to show, what I want to show with this slide is that fish, the fish that you can see, are not just in the forest, they are made of the forest. And so I needed to just sort of find the different words that I needed in order to understand that concept. And if those fish are made of kelp, made of the forest, then that means that we are made of kelp and of the forest. And there is incredible research being done by Paul Chitterow at NOAA to sort of trace that kelp carbon using isotope studies through multiple species and really give us the percentage breakdown so that we know that there are certain rockfish species and of the carbon that's in their biomass, like 50% of it is kelp carbon. So we're eating these things. We are part of the Kelp Lifeway, and you know what? We need to just make sure that more people feel that they are part of the Kelp Lifeway, so that we really sort of bring that broader attention to these particular issues, because restoring and conserving kelp forests in Puget Sound is incredibly important. So I'm just happy to be working with so many of you to try to do that. So here, these foods, I think a lot of people go to restaurants and they eat these foods without understanding that they're connected to kelp. So let's be creative about how we try to get that story out there. Hannah Garfield, also our creative engagement specialist at Puget Sound Restoration Fund, she's working to try to illustrate some of Paul Chitterow's work to show how kelp carbon is moving through the system. And you can see the yellow of the bull kelp, that canopy forest, and you can see the many species that are incorporating it, absorbing it in many ways, how it's moving through the system. And the other incredible thing about kelp forests is that they're not just in that nearshore space, so we can't just think of them as that forest below, okay? Because those nutrients are being thrown up on the shore as well. As that annual kelp species runs through its yearly cycle and it gets tossed up, thrown up on the shore, where it becomes part of that terrestrial nutrient cycling, in the same way that salmon are going out and harvesting ocean nutrients and bringing them back into the watershed in a way that enriches the soil and enriches the forests. So there are all these sea-land nutrient conveyances, and that's important too. So again, let's not limit, consign kelp forests to the aquatic system, but really understand all the ways in which they're connected. How am I doing for time? 1 minute. Wow. Okay. So we worked in 2021 to get legislative funding to support implementing the Kelp Plan with a bunch of partners who are listed here. We're going to work again with the legislature in 2023 so we can continue to get state support for getting traction on these important priorities identified in the Kelp Plan. We're working with the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation on a new Eyes on Kelp initiative, and we were totally inspired by the expedition we did in 2021, and we want to get more Eyes on Kelp. We want to do it regularly. We want to be doing underwater ecological surveys, so we're not just mapping the surface extent, we're showing and watching what kelp communities are doing underwater, all the species that they're supporting. We want to get not just human eyes, but also electronic eyes. So we're working with a group called Marauder Robotics to develop a monitoring platform that can help provide more real-time information that we can use so that we can be responsive, so that we can manage what's happening, detect what's happening, manage it more effectively. Happily, Micah Horwith did an incredible job of describing this project that we worked on north of the Hood Canal Bridge with our partner Joth Davis back there. He described the kelp farm investigation north of the Hood Canal Bridge, and I could not have done a better job, so thank you, Micah. I can rip right through there. But we're also working on another seaweed investigation that was also identified as a priority of the Blue Ribbon Panel on ocean acidification, and that is to see whether intertidal shellfish farms might provide a place where we could collect seaweed that naturally collects on aquaculture gear and try to move that back through various pathways back up onto the watershed. How are we doing for time? I'm over. Okay? This is just really telling you more about those sea-land seaweed solutions and all the things that we think and that we're trying to identify for people in various capacities throughout our communities to work on kelp. And so thank you to each and every one of you.